Hey everyone, in this video we are going to be talking about the graphs of sine and cosine. So I have the parent functions here on the screen, and as you can see that they are very similar. They both have that same wave shape. The big difference is going to be that sine goes through the origin while cosine does not. So it is basically just a translation either to the left or to the right of each other. So let's take a look at this first one. Let's look at sine. So there's a few things that I want to point out. So first off, from this relative maximum down to the midline, that would be determined by the number that's in the A spot. We call that amplitude. Okay, the basic shape that this is taking, or the pattern, is it has one bump above the x-axis and then one below. And it takes 2 pi to complete that cycle. So we say that the period of this function is 2 pi. Okay, C stands for phase shift. So right now, since this is a parent function, it's not shifting left or right. But if you had to put it somewhere, it would be right here down the middle. That would be C. And then D is our midline. So you can tell that that's the middle of the wave. That is determined by whatever number is at D. Now, everything that I have labeled here also shows up on this graph of cosine. So just as before, the distance from the minimum to the middle, that is determined by A, that is the amplitude. One cycle of cosine starts at the maximum, goes all the way to the minimum, and then back to the maximum. And it takes 2 pi to complete that cycle, so the period is also 2 pi. C would be your phase shift, so left and right. So again, this is parent function, it doesn't have one. But if you wanted to label, it would be right in the middle. And then D controls the midline. Okay, we are going to have to draw these in just a second. So there is an additional thing that I want to point out. When you are drawing sine, and you need to have one complete cycle, it is going to start with a bump at the top and a bump at the bottom. So basically, it looks kind of like a little snake. Notice that it hits the minimum, or I'm sorry, the midline at 3 spots, beginning, middle, and end. Has a maximum between the first two and a minimum between the second two. And all of this takes place within one period of sine. Okay, cosine, on the other hand, while it still makes this same shape, it starts at a different spot. So cosine makes kind of a bowl or a cup shape. So it starts and ends with a maximum, has a minimum right down in the middle, and then here it hits the midline twice. So this all takes place within one period of cosine. So just a few reminders on those transformations. Amplitude is always the absolute value of A. Period is 2 pi divided by B. For our phase shift, if it has a minus sign, it is going to the right. If it has a plus sign, it is going to the left. For vertical shift, or the one that controls the midline, if it's minus D, it is going to move down. And if it is plus D, it is moving up. Okay, so let's take a look at our first example. So I have the function f of x equals 3 over 2 sine x plus 3. So any number that you see is a transformation. So that 3 over 2 and this 3. 3 over 2 is the first number you see right away, right after the equal sign. So that makes it A. The plus 3 is at the very end, and it is also not in parentheses, so that makes it D. So this function does not have a B or a C value. Okay, so using those numbers, we're going to identify all these characteristics. Starting with amplitude. So amplitude is just straight up the A value, 3/2. Period is 2 pi, so let me include that here, 2 pi divided by B. But since we didn't have a B, that's invisible 1. And when you do this division, it just stays as 2 pi. Phase shift, there is no C, so it is not going to move left or right. Vertical shift, it has a plus 3 at the end, so that means it's going 3 up. And our midline is going to be at y equals 3. So now using these values, let's draw some guides onto my graph here. So I like to work bottom up, so let's start with the midline. Midline is going to be at positive 3, so let me draw that in. I'm just going to label it with an M for mid. Okay, got that done. Phase shift, it doesn't have one, so I'm going to check that off. But since it doesn't have one, that technically means that it's going to be starting at x equals 0, so right at the y-axis. Period is 2 pi, so starting from the y-axis, we need to finish in 2 pi. So here's 1, 2. That lets me know when I need to finish my wave. And then last is amplitude is 3/2. So starting from the midline, so see our midline was up here. Our maximum is going to be 3/2 units up and 3/2 units down. That's going to be right in the middle of the square. It's about 1.5. Okay, so I think that's all the guides that I need. So we are graphing sine. So I'm going to take a look at our sine function at the top. Okay, so this is our sine function. So one of the easiest things to do is that it begins and ends at the midline as well as right at the center of the period. So I have my period marked off here. It's this area. So it starts, it ends, and it also has it right in the middle where it hits the midline. Okay. Other thing is between the first 2 points it hits a max. Between the second 2 points it hits a min. So a max and a min. And then we're just going to connect all of those dots. Okay, and we just need to keep repeating this pattern over and over until we run out of space. So I'm just going to draw my dots in again. Okay, and there is my sine wave. Okay, let's look at our next one. So this time, we're going to be dealing with cosine. So cosine 2 of x plus 3 pi over 4 plus 4. So each number represents a transformation. Okay, so first thing is that 2. So it's not at the very front. The very front would have been A. This is kind of after the cosine, but it's in front of the x still. So this is actually our B value. 3 pi over 4 is our C because it's inside the parentheses. And that last number 4 is D. So now to use these numbers to identify our characteristics. Our amplitude, so since I didn't have an A value, there is technically an invisible 1 there. So amplitude is 1. period is 2 pi divided by b, so 2 pi divided by 2, which simplifies to just plain old pi. Phase shift, there is a 3 pi over 4 there. But since there is a plus sign, that means that we are moving towards the left. D, there is a 4 in that spot. It is plus sign, so we are moving up. So our midline is at y equals 4. So now using all this information, let's draw in some guidelines for ourselves. So starting with midline, midline at 4. Okay, and I'm going to label that with an M. Phase shift 3 pi over 4 to the left. So don't let the pi confuse you. 3 over 4 is just a fraction. So if it takes 1, 2, 3, 4 to get to an entire pi, 3 over 4 is going to be 3 squares. And I'm going to label that with a C because that was our phase shift. Then period is pi long, but you need to start counting from your C. So if pi is 4 squares, I need 4 squares away from this line. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is marking the end of the period right here. So from here to here is a period. P equals pi. Okay, and then last is the amplitude is 1. So when we're doing our maximum and minimum points, we're going to go 1 unit above the midline and 1 unit below the midline. Okay, so I think we have enough information to start graphing this. So we are doing cosine this time. So make sure you're looking at your cosine as a reference. So for cosine, it begins and ends with a maximum, and then right in the middle it has a minimum. So we're going to do that for our function. And you see where I have it marked off for the period? So begins and ends with a maximum and has a minimum right in the middle. So our little cup shape is going to look like this. Okay, now you just continue this pattern over and over again until you run out of space. So I'm going to do the left side first. And then now let's do the right side. Okay, and that is our cosine wave. So these are the graphs of our sine and cosine transformations that we just did. Please let me know if you have any questions.